You know, I know there are people in futures. Isn't that what futurists are all about? What happened? Mr. Irvin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can't comment on the futures aspect of this, but you began by asking about our position on these various provisions for certain IGs that allow the agency head to prevent the Inspector General from pursuing an investigation or audit on national security grounds. I touched on that in my prepared remarks. There is such a provision for the CIA Inspector General, for the Justice Department Inspector General, for the Department of Homeland Security's Inspector General, so I was under that provision when I was the Inspector General there, and the Treasury Inspector General. But as I mentioned in my statement, a Treasury Secretary would not have to make the argument that a particular investigation might impinge upon national security. There is a specific provision in the Treasury IG statute that allows a Treasury Secretary to stymie an investigation if, in the judgment of the Treasury Secretary, there would be adverse market effects from such an investigation without having to show any national security nexus. And my position is that all such provisions should be excised from the applicable statutes because an agency head could use such provisions, as you are suggesting, merely to shield an administration from political embarrassment or because an investigation might, in its conclusion, be contrary to the ideology of a given administration. So I'm very much opposed to those provisions. I had in my very first, and I'll conclude, I had in my very first meeting with then Secretary-designate Ridge a discussion about this very provision in the Department of Homeland Security statute. And I told him that if I were to be confirmed, I would work very hard in the spirit of full disclosure with Congress to try to get that provision excised. He assured me that he would never use the provision, and to his credit, he never did. But the fact that it was in the statute was always a potential sword of Damocles over the head of the Inspector General. And I think this present economic crisis that we are experiencing underscores how important it is to excise such provisions.
I would just want to echo my friend Mr. Irvin's comments. I think that's a very problematic provision, and I think it's something that the Congress should be reviewing.
Madam Chairwoman, if I could also comment. I can't comment as CRS on whether it would be good or bad to remove this provision, but the way the provision works now is that for the Federal Reserve, for example, the chairman makes a statement to the IG that he's going to be exercising this power, and then the IG provides the explanatory statement to Congress within 30 days. One way or one approach might be that the statement could go directly to Congress from the chairman of the Federal Reserve or from the Secretary of the Treasury so that Congress receives direct notification, and you could place a time limit, so it would occur within 3 days or 5 days or whatever, so you would know immediately if such power was being exercised.
Thank you. I'd like to direct this to Mr. Kotz. And in 2008, a request of Senator Grassley's, your office completed 2 inquiries on the effectiveness of the SEC's consolidated supervised entities and broker-deal risk assessment programs. And these were done in response to the fall of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers. Your SEC report made 26 recommendations to the SEC for areas needing improvement and several recommendations regarding the risk assessment program. First, can you tell us how many of these recommendations are in the implementation stage by the SEC? And then let me just add the other couple of questions on the same issue.
Okay, yeah, we actually just received, the way there's a process in our office. The agency comes to us and says, we'd like to close these recommendations, and then we make a decision that we think that it's appropriate to close the recommendation and provide advice on that. So we recently received from the SEC numerous requests to close recommendations. Many of the almost all the recommendations in the CSE report and many of the recommendations in the broker-dealer risk assessment report. However, I'll tell you, we're looking at them very carefully to see if we believe that sufficient work has been done to close them. So there's certainly an effort on the part of the agency to try to demonstrate that they have implemented those recommendations. But we have not completed our process as to whether we believe that they actually have been. And we're very careful, and we scrutinize very carefully what the agency has done before we actually agree that something should be closed.
Now, did you take initiative on your own to inquire how did Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers get to where they are?
Yeah, well, I mean, we conducted that audit report. We conducted the audit looking at Bear Stearns and to try to figure out how it is that this process forward while the SEC was engaged in regulation, and yet, as you said, it seemed to be a surprise to everybody. It's one thing for it to be a surprise to, an investor out there. It's another thing for it to be a surprise for the regulator who are meeting with the folks from the entities, on a common basis. And going back to your previous point, it was raised somewhat in our audit that if we issued this report, it would have some effect on the markets because it was very critical of the SEC. And there was no provision in place like with those other agencies. Those are all the presidentially appointed IG agencies. In those cases, there was a provision that allowed the agency head to stop it. In our case, it was suggested that perhaps this would have an adverse impact, and we simply said, well, thank you very much, but we're going to go ahead and issue the report anyway. So this was a case where we did feel it was important to get out the information about what happened with the SEC's regulation of Bear Stearns and provided a comprehensive report and following up to make sure they actually did what they say they were going to do.
It's like trying to unscramble eggs.
Yeah.
I don't know if it can ever be done. But anyway, did you find that there was enough there before it was revealed to really get started investigating? I think I heard you say we were taking a look at it. All of a sudden this thing blew up into the public. And I'm wondering, what were the indicators along the way?
Yeah, I mean, we found that, the SEC was aware of vulnerabilities on the part of Bear Stearns and did not place enough pressure on Bear Stearns to reduce its leverage or risk. It's a little bit difficult because hindsight is 20/20. So at that point in time, you after it happened, you look at the indicators and you say, oh, that was an indicator. But nevertheless, we did find that there were situations where the agency was aware of potential risk factors and yet did not pressure Bear Stearns enough with respect to those risk factors. We also found, for example, that there were certain standards that the SEC could have been tougher with requiring Bear Stearns to comply with. We found that the SEC authorized those firms to have internal audit staff perform critical audit work. So they allowed internal audit staff to perform the audit work involving risk management rather than have an outside entity. Obviously, if you have an outside entity, you're going to have better audit work. So there were specific areas that we found that we felt, after looking at it, even with hindsight being 20/20, that said, these are indicators. You missed these indicators. How come you didn't see this at the time? And then we make recommendations so the SEC now knows how to deal with things going forward.
You deserve a drink of water. I'm going to go to Mr. Desarno. What are, Mr. Desarno, the greatest challenges that now face the NCUA in its oversight of the credit union industry? And are credit unions also experiencing higher default rates from mortgages? And has the recession exposed an increasing number of NCUA insured institutions?
Well, let me say, first of all, that I've been at NCUA for about 11 years, and this is the first time we've had to do any material loss reviews. So what that means is that we've never had losses to the share insurance fund of $10 million or more, and we're having them now. But with that said, I think I can comfortably say that the credit union industry is much better off than the banking industry, and it may sound self-serving, but it's because they really didn't get involved in a lot of the riskier investments and investments. For the most part, credit unions were involved. They did make mortgages and they did make mortgage loans, but and they are having some higher default rates, but that's not causing them the problems of going out of business. The material loss reviews that we have done so far in two specific credit unions And the reason those credit unions went down is because they got involved in very speculative real estate deals outside of their area of influence. These were credit unions that in the middle of the country that decided they were going to get involved in the real estate market in Florida, and when the housing market went down, then they lost an awful lot of money. And NCOA now is taking steps to prevent that from happening in the future. Looking forward, what are the most critical challenges right now? I think the most critical challenge right now for NCOA is dealing with the corporate credit structure. They're taking action right now. And because the corporate credit unions were the ones that were involved in investing in mortgage-backed securities, and of course they got bit by the mortgage-backed security problem that everyone else has run into. And so NCOA right now is in the process of trying to restructure the corporate credit unions, and I think that will have a positive impact on the credit union industry as we go forward.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Levick.
The futures industry has had some instances of bankruptcy, failure, but certainly not to the same extent as commercial banks, or from what Bill says, credit unions. Partly, I think, it's because of the provision of margin. You have to put up margin to buy a futures contract, and that is adjusted. Am I correct, Judy? Is back here? Yeah. Daily. So, for example, if your price of your stock goes down, or your future, you had to put up more margin. So there have been some failures, but interestingly enough, the two I'm aware of were not recently. They go back, one case about 5 years. The fellow who was in charge, it was a rather big, what they call a future commission merchant, is now spending some time in jail. And there was a one about 2 or 3 years ago. But anyway, the point being, I can't think of one right now of a large size that has been in the recent economic turmoil. We've been lucky.
Yeah, I always saw credit unions differently because it's the field of people who invest in their credit union, and usually they're in...
It's a cooperative move.
It's a cooperative move. And they don't take the same kind of risk. And I've always been stunned by the fact that we don't know what's inside those portfolios. And when you make the wrong decision, we suffer. And so, you know, not being able to get to that kind of information leaves it strung out. I want to know also, has the newly combined Council on Inspector Generals for Integrity and Efficiency improve the coordination and the efficacy of IGs? Anybody want to talk about improvement?
The one thing I would say is that when you met separately, there were usually 25 to 30 people in the room, depending on a particular time. Now there's almost 60. And my impression generally, and I think there's some studies on this, the more people you have in a room can inhibit decision-making or consensus. Now that has some pluses, but frankly, and I will defer to my deputy back here, Miss Judith Ringel, because you've actually gone to the meetings, haven't you? What is your...
So far they're crowded.
They're crowded, she says.
Crowded.
Yeah. I have to say, as you can probably tell from my comments, I'm not sure it was a positive move to combine the two.
Do they feel intimidated? Do you think that large group sitting among the experts?
You know, I don't know. I've always been in the ECIE. And I used to go to some of their meetings because I was adjunct. I didn't feel intimidated. It's like any, but that was smaller. That was 30 people. It's like anything. You find some really sharp PCIEs, and you find some sharp, maybe ECIEs, but you find some who aren't that much.
I just want to add a comment to that as well. We've only had about, I think we've had maybe three joint meetings now so far as this CIGIE. And I think it is helpful, even though it's a bigger room and it's a much bigger setting. I think it's good that everybody meets at the same time and we're all getting the same message at the same time. Because in the past, even though we had we met individually as a PCIE and was a smaller group, a lot of times we weren't getting the same message as the PC, i.e. presidentially appointed IGs. So I think now we're all getting the same message. We all have the same opportunities. So I think it'll work out for the best.
Thank you. Ms. Burrows, how are the DFE IGs currently evaluated when their agency heads have the appointment authority? And are there independent evaluations that are conducted, or is it done by agency personnel? And is the process different from the presidential appointment IG?
Well, currently, both the presidentially appointed IGs and the designated federal entity IGs have to be appointed without regard to political affiliation and solely based on their skills in auditing and other management and other types of skills. But I couldn't necessarily speak to how each agency decides how to appoint its IG. It might vary between the agency. I don't think that there's necessarily any criteria that they're looking for. But that might be a question that I could, research and get back to you.
Could you do that?
Sure, of course.
Put it in writing. We'd appreciate that.
Excuse me, Madam.
Yeah.
One of the things in our agency, when I was initially appointed, the person did rate me. But I would say it's well over 10 years ago now that we came to an agreement that we are not rated and we don't take bonuses. This is even before the legislation that's now forbids it. And that's certainly very helpful because there are subtle pressures one can make in ratings and so on, as we're all aware of. But at least, as I say in my agency, and I can't speak for that, though I think there are many others are not evaluated, rated by their chairman. But certainly the CFTC, we haven't been, and that goes back, I'd say, to 1998, several years.
Yeah, the situation is very similar at NCUA. I do not, we're on a merit pay system. So I receive kind of like a pass-fail evaluation almost, but my average increase is just the average of what the other senior staff receive for that year. So it's not a written performance evaluation. So I'm not going to be downgraded or penalized if I issue a hard-hitting report. I mean, that won't happen. And so my increase would just be the average of what the other senior staff members get.
If I could also add, in 2005, there was a controversy with the Legal Services Corporation that they had tried, the board of the Legal Services Corporation had tried to impose performance evaluations on their IG after their IG had issued some reports that were highly critical of how the agency was spending its resources, because it's an agency that generally provides legal services to the poor. And CRS had done an analysis as to whether it was legally tenable to require performance evaluations of IGs. There's no specific part in the IG Act that would prohibit a performance evaluation, but the general tenets of the IG Act in terms of independence and only general supervision by the agency head would seem to indicate that that would not be a favorable avenue to pursue in terms of the agency head conducting a performance evaluation of its IG. But that could be something that Congress could clarify, that this would be a prohibited act to conduct a performance evaluation of an IG.
Madam Chairwoman, in our review of the Inspectors General, our sense was the only time that was at all operative was prior to the legislation, when some DFEs were actually receiving bonuses, many of which wouldn't accept them even though they were eligible to, because...
Please don't mention the B word, bonuses.
Right. Well, I mean, and as you can imagine, there's such a problem with that. And so that is, the law then prohibited such bonuses and sort of removed that concept from the IG system as far as I understand.
And if I could add to that, in my experience as a presidentially appointed IG, I'd say a couple things.
Move that mic.
Yes. May I dispense with it? I don't know that it's necessary, but...
I hear you without it.
I can.
You can? Okay.
All right. Is that all right?
So the rays are colliding.
All right.
Let's see.
For presidentially appointed IGs, there really isn't an evaluation process per se. Certainly, there's no evaluation by the agency head. Of course, if there are complaints against an IG, those could be lodged with the PCIe under the old system, and that system continues to this day. A complaint can be lodged, and that's investigated. In terms of salary, compensation, as Ms. Bryan said, the issue arose of, since a presidentially appointed IG controlled his or her budget, in theory, an IG could give himself or herself a bonus, but that was never done. Obviously, it was frowned upon. If I just might take this also to say a quick word, since we're talking about bonuses and salaries.
Please do, because you were the next I was going to call on, and I think you're addressing most of my questions. So go ahead.
On this salary issue, because it's tangentially related, a number of people have raised the point that one of the effects of this legislation that we're here to talk about would be, in effect, to lower the compensation of inspectors general who are not presidentially appointed if they were to be. And certainly that is a legitimate concern. I think that should be addressed separately. Of course, I would not support an effect where, as a consequence of this, their salaries would be diminished. But to me, that is not an argument for not appointing, making these inspectors general presidentially appointed. As I say, doing so clearly and only logically, it seems to me, would enhance their independence.
Thank you so much. You covered some of the questions I was going to ask, so we're going to go to our last witness now, Ms. Bryan. Our recommendation continues in your most recent report on IG states that Congress should consider adding more meaningful and reflective reporting requirements to statutorily require semi-annual reports. So please describe for us what some of these might be.
Well, what I found is when we looked at the numbers, and this goes back to my earlier questioning of using numbers to measure the effectiveness of an IG's work, one of the measures that an IG is required to report in their SAR, which we found, sadly, there's a lot of work that goes into these semi-annual reports or SARs, and I'm sad to report how few people read those reports because they're really boring. They're full of a lot of numbers,
words, many pages,
and you know, it's just calling it as it is. And so, one example of that is that they are to report the numbers of cases referred for prosecution, and that's a measurement that's been used. I was with a former deputy director of OMB where he was testifying that was a real measure of of the work of an IG. But when we got behind those numbers, you found that it really doesn't tell you very much. So, for example, if the numbers of referrals for prosecution from an IG shop is declining, it is assumed that means they're working less hard. It could be, however, that they're taking on much more important, putting their resources into much more important audits that aren't beefing the numbers up but are taking a lot more resources. Another thing to keep in mind is we found over the last 10 years, we talked to a lot of prosecutors, and it turns out that that the IG shops are referring fewer bad cases. What we found was a pretty high declination rate. They would refer a lot of cases for prosecution. The U.S. attorneys would look at them and say, this is a dog, I'm not going to do it. So there was a pretty high declination rate. Now what we're finding is the declination rate is much lower because the IGs are referring fewer but stronger cases, and they're actually consulting with U.S. attorneys, you know, early on in a more consultative way. So those are sort of the examples of why the numbers aren't very effective. We thought the better way of approaching reports to Congress were to look at what the IG thought was the most important work. What were the things they really wanted the Congress to be aware of that was happening in their agencies? If that kind of reporting is done and really focus the SARs in those ways, then maybe you would be able to find out, you know, as an early warning in some of these crises that are approaching us, and we're saying, how do we find out about them after the fact?
I appreciate that. And we've seen a couple of cases in recent years where the IGs were found to have acted inappropriately or to have conflicts with the very agencies they are charged with overseeing. And are there adequate measures in place, such as peer review, which has been mentioned already, or external monitoring programs to keep check on these IG offices?
Thank you for that question. We looked at the mechanism that is used to evaluate an IG's poor conduct is the Integrity Committee and that continues to be the case through the law is now statutorily created. And we think that's a pretty good model where it is other IGs reviewing allegations of misconduct. However, there are some flaws in its execution. One is that we found what has been happening is the Integrity Committee will have a finding, or will go through an entire lengthy investigation, but that won't have an actual finding at the end of the day. In one fairly famous case, the conclusion was that the IG should be disciplined up to and including removal from office. And it was in the last administration, and the OMB received this information and then came back to the Integrity Committee and said, so are you saying he should be removed? And because they hadn't really made that conclusion, they said, well, we didn't say that, and so nothing actually happened. And so we think that's a change that needs to occur. The other we believe is that the Integrity Committee is currently now statutorily headed up by a member of the FBI. And the problem with that is that the FBI is, of course, looking for criminality. Rarely, I would hope, is it going to be the case that an IG is accused of criminality when it's going to be more a case of poor judgment or inappropriate behavior for an IG. And we had another case where an IG was actually acknowledged that he had provided to the president, this was a presidentially appointed IG, provided to the president a very controversial report of his prior to its release for his counsel's opportunity to redact information. The Integrity Committee concluded that he didn't violate the law, which is true. However, I would believe, most IGs would agree with me, and I certainly believe, that that was really inappropriate behavior for an IG. So if that committee were headed up by an IG rather than a member of the FBI, I think the standards for conduct would be more appropriate.
Well, I want to thank Mr. Kotz, Mr. Cerno, Mr. Lavick, Ms. Burrows, Mr. Irwin, and Ms. Bryan for your expert testimony, and believe me, we've taken a lot of this down. Our work is just beginning. And if there's one place that I think Congress has failed, and that is in its oversight duties. As the Secretary of Labor said in her acceptance speech, there's a new sheriff in town. So I want to thank my colleagues who were here and had to leave, and I want to thank each and every one of you for the time you have given us this afternoon and the wealth of information to start our wheels rolling. I think you're going to see a difference now with the new administration and more openness and our concerns about how do we get ourselves into this mess. We've got to answer to the people who sent us here to Washington. We expect to be able to do that, and we expect to be able to mitigate some of these problems, provide solutions so that they who pay their taxes will have a better quality of life. So without objection, this committee is adjourned with a sincere thanks to all of you and my staff.
Probably clear to everyone, but I just want to make it clear that there is no sense in which the program is limited to the primary sounds like your question is probably not best directed to Mr. Nelson, but related to an SBA-related matter. I would encourage you actually to talk to one of the members' staff after we break up, and perhaps they can follow up with you.
I would note, though, that the SBA loans to Small Business Administration, ABS backed by SBA loans are one of the assets that are accepted under the program currently. So it is hoped that the TALF will also encourage small business lending.
Other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Milan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Perhaps if folks would like to sort of line up at the mic in the interest of time, please introduce yourself when you state your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. My name is Brian Milan, Chairman and CEO of Whitestone Capital Group. We're a financial advisor to the federal government. Mr. Nelson, thank you for your time today, sir. My question relates to TARP in general, but I guess TALF as well. There's been a lot of talk about the solution on one side, but what are we doing to motivate the banks to actually sell the assets? There's very little discussion about that. Given FASB 156 and other regulations that have allowed the banks not to sell, as you know, because of the loss they would incur and the adverse effect it has on Tier 1 capital, which then could make them capital impaired, then the OCC comes down and they get, obviously, in trouble. So one of the questions is, what can the Fed do? Obviously, you've given them capital. They have not used that capital to sell assets. I'm not sure if the banks are using the capital just in general, so that no one says, sell these assets now, incur that loss. Therefore, the question is, would it be more appropriate for the Federal Reserve to modify your plan so that if a bank sells, or when they sell, you would then give them an equal and opposite capital injection to mitigate the loss? They sell $1 billion of assets, they have a loss of, say, $400 million. As opposed to giving them $100 billion or $20 billion, you say, we're going to give you $400 million in capital, voting, non-voting, with warrants, whatever you want, but it directly matches one-to-one. To me, that incentivizes the banks to sell. The world knows the banks are not capital impaired. CEOs know that they can now move forward, and the market becomes, I think, much more liquid. Your thoughts, please.
So I'll do my best. I'm not really, I'm not a bank supervisor, and I'm not as conversant in how that program will work. So if the TALF were extended to legacy assets, as the TALF is expanded to legacy assets, which is currently under review, the incentive that it would provide to banks to sell would be by improving the price at which a sale would be possible. So by making financing available and some downside protection, the program would be intended to intended to raise prices of the legacy assets so that investors could purchase them.
Thank you.
I think that it would be more appropriate from the Treasury or from somebody designing the other aspects of the program to respond. But I'll take that suggestion back.
Just one comment. We're going to try to get in as many questions as possible. We only have 15 minutes left in this session, so I would encourage you to be succinct in your questions. If you don't get to state your questions, you can submit them and we will send them to Mr. Nelson. We'll be sure that you get a response.
Yes, my name is Jones, Charles R. Jones. From a design perspective, I'm looking at the 16 agents that you have involved with the program, the TALF program. Why can't you match them up with some minority business concerns as a design element? Inherently, that allows us to get work and move forward. So I'm suggesting that you bring in several individuals from this group to work directly with you to design